So we're going to go on to question 4. Question 4 has us taking a list of words, and we're going to take these words and put spacing in between these words so they fill up a particular length. In this case, we've got a length of 20. We've got 4 words here. Notice I've got AP, which is 2 letters long, comp, which is 4, sci, which is 3, and rocks, which is 5. So that's 6 plus 3 is 9 plus 5 has a length of 14. So I've got 14 letters here. So 20 minus 14 is going to give me 6 spaces that I need to put in between. And notice that if I have 4 words here, that I'm going to have 3 gaps. And if I take 6 and divide by 3, that means each of these gaps are going to be 2 spaces long. And notice that I've got a gap of 2 spaces here, a gap of 2 spaces here, and a gap of 2 spaces here. So we're going to be involving this math computation, which works wonderfully if the spacing gets to be exact. Unfortunately, it's not always exact. So here I've got green, eggs, and ham, and this adds up to 15. So if I take 20 minus 15, that's going to leave 5 spaces. But I've got 3 gaps to put those in. 5 divided by 3, according to integers, is 1, which means each of these words should have 1 space between them. The problem, though, is if I take these 15 letters and I add 3 spaces, that's really only 18, which means I'm too short. And the idea behind this too short is that I'm going to take these spots and put them in front of the first 2 opportunities that I can. So these spaces are going to be as close together as possible, 2, 2, and 1, as close together as can reasonably be done to accommodate this total length of 20. Now, every list is going to have at least 2 words in it. So here I've got beach and ball, which adds up to 9 letters. And I only have 1 gap here, which means that the 20 minus 9, which is 11, divided by 1 means that I'm going to have 11 spaces filled up here. So our objective here is we're going to have to figure out, okay, how much is this average gap here? How short are we? And how best can we build this string so that the appropriate spaces are in the appropriate spots? So that's our objective in this problem. Let's start with this idea of, okay, how many letters do we really have? Keep in mind that I'm going to have a list of words. Each of these words is guaranteed not to have any spaces. They're just going to be letters. So what I need to do is I need to go through this array list and calculate how many letters we've got. Now, because I have to return an int, the first thing I'm going to do is create an int count gets 0 and make sure that I return count. So now all I need to do is go through the list and actually calculate the words. So I'm going to have a for each loop. So I'm going to have string s in word list. And I'm going to say that count is going to be incremented by s.length. And so that's all that I really need here. This is going to go through each one. It's going to say, the word A has 1 letter. The word frog has 4 letters, which means now I have 5. And then the word is has 2 letters, and if I add that 2, that's going to give me 7. So this is pretty straightforward. And what also is straightforward is that calculation that we were talking about. Notice here, if I want to figure out what this basic gap width is, what we did is we figured out, okay, I've got a particular length. In this case, it was 20 in the examples that we did. And I'm going to have some word list which I can call upon total letters to figure out how many letters I've got. So remember, it's going to be 20 minus the number of total letters. And I'm going to have to divide it by the number of gaps. Well, remember that the number of gaps was the total number of words minus 1. So I'm going to need to make sure that I return this calculation of formatted length minus the number of letters, which I'm going to determine from word list, divided by the number of words in word list. So I'm going to have to ask word list its size and then subtract 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to return, and I'm going to have to do this calculation. My numerator is going to be formatted len minus, and I'm going to have to ask total letters how many letters word list has. So total letters for word list. And that's going to be my numerator. I'm going to divide by this idea of a difference. Remember, this comes from word list dot size. And if I have 4 words, I'm always going to have one less for the number of gaps. So it's going to be -1. So I can do this all in one line of code. Just return the result of this calculation. I could break it apart into different steps, break apart the numerator, the denominator, and so forth. What makes this problem tedious is this idea of, okay, how do we actually go about putting the string together? And so I think it's probably going to be best to go back to one of these examples and talk about how it's done. So I'm going to go back to this example here because this one was one that was kind of awkward. I'm going to erase this up. Now, I have calculations that had to be done. I had to figure out, okay, how much is my basic gap width? Remember, of course, that we had a method for that. We have this basic gap width method that allows us to figure out what the basic gap width is. So I can create a gap that's that long, some variable, which is going to have one space in it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to have word plus gap plus, and then if I need a leftover space, and I'll be able to determine how many of those leftover spaces I need, I'll take care of those first. Word plus gap plus a leftover space. As long as I need that many leftover spaces. In this case, I needed 2 leftover spaces. So notice that I have my word, I've got my gap, and then I have my leftover space. And then I have my word, I have my gap, and then I have my leftover space. Now, once I've taken care of 2 leftover spaces, everything else is going to be a word followed by a gap until I've done all of my gaps. Remember that my number of gaps is going to be equal to the number of words minus 1. And then I'm just going to tack this last word on as a fence post case. So it's just going to be adding it to my output. So going to the code that we're going to have to write for part C, I need to physically write this out. Notice that I'm going to be creating a string. So first thing I'm going to do is create string output, which is just going to be an empty string. I need to figure out how long that basic gap is going to be. So I'm going to create an int called basic, and this is going to be given to me by basic gap length given word list and given formatted length. So that's going to tell me how long my gap is going to be. Now what I need to do is I need to actually build my gap. So I'm going to create a gap variable, and it's also going to be an empty string, but I'm going to go through int I gets 0, I is less than basic, I plus plus, and just build gap together. And I'm going to say gap is going to get gap plus a space. And so that's going to build together my gap. So now gap is this variable that keeps track of the space between the words. I also have a leftover spaces method. So I'm going to say int left is going to be leftover spaces given, of course, my word list and formatted length. And I'm going to have a number of words that I'm going to keep track of. Notice that some of my words will have the gap and the leftover space, and some of my words will only have the gap. and it's going to be the first words that have the leftover space added to them. So I'm going to go ahead and set up a word count variable. So int word count at 0. And I've got my output variable, so while word count is less than the number of leftover spaces that I've got. As long as this word count is less than the leftover spaces I've got, I'm going to go ahead and start building my output. So output is going to get output plus my word. So I'm going to have to do word list dot get, and I'm going to have to get w count from my word list plus my gap plus some space. This is going to be one of my leftover spaces, and then I'm going to have to increment my word count. So this is taking care of the first part of the list that we were talking about. This is taking care of, here's word count is 0, so I got 0, added my gap, added one space, word count is now 1. Got word sub 1, added my gap, added my space, word count is now 2, and now word count is not left over, is not less than leftover spaces. So now I don't want to add any more of those leftover spaces. I just want to add my wordList.get and my gap. So I'm going to say while, and I'm going to say word count is less than wordList.size minus 1. And I have that minus 1 because remember that I'm going to have to treat this example here as a fence post problem. So I only want to add one more out of this list of 4. I've taken care of 0 and 1. I only want to make sure I add 2 because this is going to be a fence post problem. So I'm going to go back to my code, and these are going to be adding everything but that space. So I'm going to say output gets output plus wordList.get, whatever word count is, plus gap, and then word count plus plus. And then once I've done that, the last thing I need to do is take care of that fence post case, is to say that output is going to get output plus output plus, I'm going to add word list dot get, and I'm going to get word list dot size minus 1. I want to make sure I get the last letter in that word list and then return output. And so this allows me to take care of this last letter here, this last word, ham. So I'm going to go in, because my size is 4, this is in spot 3, so I'm going to retrieve what's in spot n-1, size minus 1. Concatenate it to the end of this output that I've been building since the beginning of the program, and then return my output statement. So this takes care of problem number 4.